Okay.
There we go. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a nice lunch, managed to get a bit of fresh air or whatever. And so now I'm pleased to introduce Joe Griffen, who's going to tell us lots of stuff about data flows. I'm particularly looking forward to this. If you could please mute yourselves, unless you want to ask a question. And of course, feel free to type into the chat if you have a question or comment to make. So I think with that, over to you, Joe.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ferden. Yep, so as we said already, we're hopefully going to get to the bottom and introduce data flows to you in terms of the why, what, and the how. So broad agenda is, I think it's useful, first of all, just to take a look at the landscape that we've got currently around data integration, just to see, okay, well, why would data flows be a potential candidate for you to consider? Jump in and look at them in a bit more detail. We'll compare and contrast a few things because you may hear about data flows in Power Apps and Power BI. So we need to just qualify a few of those. We'll look at some of the extensibility options we've got from an Azure standpoint, and then we'll jump into a demo. And then we'll close things off with just some final thoughts and hopefully have some time at the end for questions. So a little bit about me on the slide here. So yeah, my name's Joe. I'm based in the UK, obviously, consulting mainly on the technical side of D365 and also a lot of Azure as well these days. So you can find me on those links there. Feel free to connect with me, check out the blog. And as you can see, I do like to hoard badges. It's an addiction, I think. I think if I just resign myself, I'm addicted to getting badges. But anyway, moving on. So data flow. So I'm here today and I'm banging on about something new. So you may recall if you were at one of the in-person events, gosh, it must have been 2 years ago now. I was evangelizing and banging on a lot about Azure Data Factory and why that was such a good solution. So you may be thinking, okay, well, what snake oil are you selling us today, Joe? Why are you banging on about all this now? Well, I still can hold and contend that Azure Data Factory is a really great tool. From an integration standpoint, if you're looking to sort of achieve those sort of requirements that you would traditionally need via tools such as SSIS, it's a really good tool. But it does have some caveats with it, so it's not going to be something that, if you are coming in with your citizen developer hat on, you're going to struggle. You're going to, you'll get there eventually, but it's not a tool that you can easily sort of embrace and not necessarily, do complicated things with straight out of the gate with it. I think as well, it's very much based in Azure, so you need that technical or financial commitment around that. In some cases, it may be overkill for what you need. If you just want to get, data from A to B with just some simple mappings, then ADF, okay, yeah, it can do it, but is it just overcomplicating it necessarily? And I think as well, a consideration around ADF is that, if on-premise connectivity is a concern around what we're doing, then of course ADF does support that, but we need to have a separate connector installed. So therefore, potentially we're complicating our IT estate. We're having to maybe set up separate gateway machines, and all that to go with it. So potentially, in some situations, ADF may not be a good candidate. But then when we look wider in terms of what we've got alternative wise in the platform, well, these days, okay, we've still got the data import wizard, so we can open up the classic browser, wait 10 minutes for it to load, and then from there we can actually import in and do these straight mappings for our tables, for our entities very easily. I guess the thing is around that is that, okay, it only covers those simple requirements. It's also in the classic interface as well. So we therefore, we're having to sort of maybe wait and go put the kettle on, and there may be a bit of concern. Anything that's labeled classic these days, could be seen as being potentially at risk. As an alternative, okay, you could use SSIS still. You could use that, get the Kingswaysoft adapter. This is a tried and tested tool. My general commentary around SSIS is that, again, it does have a bit of a legacy feel to it. And certainly, again, it's not going to be simple for you to build out those packages. It's probably at a similar technical or effort level compared to Data Factory. Bespoke integration is, of course, an option. But again, do you want to be writing code for this when you could just use something off the shelf? So ultimately, I think when we look at the wider landscape, we've not really got anything which is, I guess, current from a technology standpoint, and also is going to be relatively inexpensive for us to use as well. So enter stage left Dataflows. So this is sort of our new sort of next generation ETL tool that we've got that allows us not only to get our data into Microsoft Dataverse, but also export it out into an Azure data lake as well, if we want to do that big data analysis. So, regardless of the type of potential data sources we want to work with, we can connect to them. So whether it's SQL, flat file, other cloud services, other Microsoft Dataverse or Dynamics 365 instances we can connect to, courtesy of the OData Web API. We can use this to basically bring our data sources together, get it all mashed up into something that we think is ready to go, and get that sort of imported in to our Dataverse or 365 environment based on a schedule that we sort of define. And the benefits of this is a fully cloud-hosted tool, so it's embedded very neatly within the Power Apps Maker portal, and we've got that compatibility with our on-premise gateway. So if we're already using that for our flows, for our Power BI reports, then we can very quickly and easily with some caveats, as I'll go on to, start using it with that, and drive some additional benefits from it. So the types of scenarios we can look at with Dataflow that we can sort of achieve, as I mentioned already, scheduled data refresh. So if you need to pull data in every weekday at 9 a.m., it's going to handle this. If you've got those more complex data import routines that won't very easily, they're basically going to take you hours in Excel if you were to go in via the sort of the old import data wizard, this is where potentially the most benefit can be had. So if you've got those complex relationship mappings, if you need to do, custom columns, derived columns, if you need to convert data, all of that stuff, it will take you a lot of time fiddling about in Excel. Nobody wants to do that really. I mean, we want to get away from Excel as much as possible with this stuff, don't we? So really, that's where I think Dataflows have a real big advantage. I think finally as well, if you set them up correctly, you can actually achieve a degree of sort of synchronization between a Dataverse system and your external sources. So the broad steps of doing that is that you, as I mentioned already, connect up to your Dataverse environment using a Dataflow, bring in your data from your other source around that, make sure that you've got a sort of suitable key column or multiple key columns that you can use. Then you've got a special setting that you can use called delete rows that no longer exist in the query output to effectively then ensure that each time the data flow executes, it's effectively matching up your data, removing any rows that may have been removed, and obviously keeping your latest data either sort of created or updated as part of that. So potentially quite a few ways in which we can start to use Dataflows. And a lot of this functionality is achieved because we've got Power Query sort of really baked in as part of this experience. So as we'll see in the demo, when you're building out your data flow for the first time, you get basically a sort of a full flavor Power Query editor experience. In a lot of ways, it's virtually indistinguishable from what you would see as part of Power BI Desktop or indeed Excel if you're using Power Query Editor in there. So all the things that you can sort of expect to be able to do as part of that will be available. Having said that, there are some differences to be sort of aware of as you sort of get into it. So as an example, an important step that you need to do as part of setting up a data flow for the first time is to make sure that you've defined your key columns. So this isn't the key in the sense of, okay, your primary key ID record for your Dataverse record. This is the key column or columns within your source data set that you're bringing in that sort of guarantee its uniqueness each time. So typically, if you're bringing it in from, let's say, a SQL Server based data source, you may have like an int or an identity column that you're using as part of that. It could be that maybe you've got a composite key that you want to bring together. But ultimately, if you tag this on, you can make sure that that setting that I spoke about earlier, delete from source if it's no longer there, you can sort of make sure that you've got that. You can have that behavior sort of supported as part of that. Another setting as well is that, and this is more applicable for when you're getting your data flows to export out into Azure, is map to entity. So this is actually a pretty new feature. In fact, as part of preparing for this, it took me by surprise actually, because I saw, oh wow, we've got this now. But effectively what you can do here is take your data from your source, map it out into the sort of the common set of tables, entities, and attributes that we get within the common data model. So things like, for example, your account, your contact, your order, all of that stuff that basically all of the major cloud providers such as Microsoft, Adobe, and SAP have agreed are sort of the common data objects. We can map out our data into that, and then when we export it out into Azure, we've got it in a sort of CDM ready mode. So if indeed we want to get it back into Dataverse, if we want to get it out into SAP or into another system, then it hopefully eases that process because we've got things mapped out into the CDM. So therefore, the system that we're going into should have a fairly good chance of accepting that without us having to fiddle about with it too much. So I mentioned already, okay, so Dataflows is a concept that is used across both Power BI and Power Apps. So you may hear about Dataflows, but Power BI Dataflows. It's worth just stating that they aren't the same thing. They do sort of very similar sort of things, mainly from a sort of Power Query editor perspective. So all that mashup, all that, bringing in data sources experience will be very similar. The key difference with Power BI Dataflows is that they are designed for when you want to get these prepared data models out so that people can then consume them as part of their Power BI reports and their dashboards. In comparison for that, Power Apps Dataflows are instead designed for the integration scenarios that I've spoken about already. So if you set up a data flow in Power Apps, it's not going to appear in Power BI, vice versa. Ultimately, okay, that's me. But ultimately, if you've got queries that are defined in both, they should be broadly cross-compatible because they're using Power Query, but you will need to effectively transfer those over and maybe just give them a bit of a fiddle. And I think as well, which is a bit of a burn, is that the Power BI Dataflows do have some really nice AI stuff which we haven't yet got in Dataflows. Here's hoping in the future that maybe we get some of that cool stuff as well. So as I mentioned already, you've got this extensibility to Azure built in. So you can configure your data flow to basically fire up and go out into a data lake storage Gen 2 location. So that will then export out not only your data, but also the definitions for your data flow as well, which is quite nice. And then finally, if you did find yourself hitting a bit of a ceiling, and indeed you wanted to then move across into something like Azure Data Factory, then you can very easily do this. You've now got within Data Factory what's called a data wrangling activity, and that's basically just Power Query activity. So you can just take your Power Query queries, say that fast 66 times, move those across into Data Factory, and then from there you can then start to embed on additional features, such as maybe calling store procedures or deleting rows or doing lookups and things like that. So you're probably thinking, okay, well, what's the catch here? This must be like something which we're going to need full-blown licenses for. Well, actually, at the moment, it's sort of free in a way. So if you've already got a Power Apps sort of per app per user, or indeed an applicable Dynamics 365 SKU, then you've got all this out of the box and you can start using it with pretty much sort of no limitations around it. So I don't know whether this may change in the future. Maybe if take-up starts happening and people are scheduling, 50 data flows an hour and it's really hammering things, that maybe things might change. But at the moment, you can actually use this and it's sort of included as part of what you pay each month. So, that's really nice that we've got this quite rich capability just as a bit of a bonus, really, in terms of our main subscription. Now, if you are in this sort of the per app scenario, then there will be some situations where you may hit a few bugs. I think it's something that Microsoft's aware of at the moment. So basically, a per app, if you've got a per app license assigned to your Canvas app and you try and then call a data flow from there, then you may get errors or the data flow just won't run at all. I think it's something that Microsoft are aware of, they're working on, but generally per user will probably just give you that clean experience until Microsoft have fixed that up. So Dean's got a great question in the chat. Does this take up API limits from the user who is running the data flow? So yeah, so basically you have to authenticate into Dynamics to sort of achieve this. I think it takes it off the tenant capacity in terms of consumption on there. I will have to go away and just double check that one in terms of what the exact rules are. But effectively, yeah, if you are, API limits for Dataverse will always be sort of enforced in one way or the other, and you probably need to use the Power Platform Admin Center just to sort of keep an eye on that, really. Okay, so this all may be sounding really great at this point, but it's worth just flagging a couple of things, little things maybe, which you might find a bit annoying or maybe a bit of a blocker for you when you're using these tools. So as an example, we can't do things such as, for example, call store procedures from SQL. I don't know about you, but sometimes there will be scenarios where it will just be easy. Okay, I'll just write a quick SQL store procedure just to do something for me. So you won't be able to do anything like that using a data flow because of how it's all built out. Things like your common programming constructs, so apply to, for each, all that sort of stuff, you won't be able to replicate that purely because it's not something that Power Query supports. You won't, and this burned me recently as part of a project, you won't be able to work with your data flows programmatically. So as an example, for a scenario that I was dealing with, I wanted to have it so that I could call a data flow, trigger it based on, let's say, a Power Automate flow being run. Unfortunately, at the moment, the APIs or anything like that aren't exposed out to do that. So effectively, it's either on demand to schedule it, or you set your schedule, or that's it, you bust basically. Another thing as well as a bit of a gotcha just to watch out for is that, as I said already, it does support the on-premise gateway, this tool, but you need to make sure it's actually installed in the same region as your current Dataverse tenant. So if, for example, your Dataverse environment is in UK West, but you set up your on-premise data gateway for West Europe, it won't be visible at all, and you won't be able to use it as part of your Dataverse, as part of your data flow. So you may just need to double check that. You may need to perhaps maybe install another gateway just to cover that off, or indeed change the configuration of your current gateway just to get around that. A little bit annoying, but yeah, hopefully if you're aware of it now, you can hopefully watch out for it if it ever happens to you in the future. Okay, so all this sounds good, but let's get in and take a bit more look at what this is all about. So I'm going to jump first of all to Windows SQL Server R2. I hate working with server environments. When I was doing this, the prep for this, I remembered how much I hated this. But effectively what we've got here is my local server, okay? So we can see that we've got our on-premise gateway set up for a particular environment when it all loads up. So yep, so we've got our gateway set up. It's all set up and basically good to go, aligned to our particular environment that we're connected to. And we just got SQL Server installed on this and the good old AdventureWorks 2012 database. So what we wanted to do as part of using our data flow is basically get data from our AdventureWorks sort of database. We're interested primarily in our sort of person data. We want to map that across into our contact table as part of that. So if we take a look at the records which we want to get at the moment, so it's fairly nicely sort of normalized data. So we can see we can get our first name, middle name, last name, and things like that out of it quite straightforwardly. But when we look at the way this is structured out in the database via this diagram, we can see things get a little bit more complicated, okay? So, whereas on the contact table, for example, the email column is on there and ready to go. Actually, what we need to do here is actually query a separate table to get that in. We have to do all these sort of massive joins to be able to get this in. So although maybe we could spend some time writing a SQL query and get out into a flat file, it's a little bit onerous to do all that. So effectively, Dataflows can help us to sort of get around this by making it very easy to start to map out to complex, I think we call them star schemas or something like that, snowflake schemas, whatever your schema of choice is, Dataflows is hopefully going to be able to handle it. So at the moment, we've got about 1,500 contacts that have been synced up already to our environment. I'm just going to open up now our Maker portal. What I'm going to do first of all is that I'm going to prepare some additional contacts that I want to sync up into the environment. So I should do this in pure pledge prestige fashion. So I show you a view first of all that shows me contacts that have been created today. As we can see, nothing's in here. That will change. Let's go back onto here. So we've decided we want to get some additional contacts synced up to our environment. So it's about 24, as we can see down here in total. So all I need to do is just run a quick SQL query. I just want to update this so that it's looking at so that we are. Let me just remove that there. So yeah, query slightly wrong. Let me just remove that there. So I want to, so it's going to be in for that. Yep, so let's do that. I'm just going to update this, and this is going to be our flag now so that these records go up into our Dataverse environment, all being well. Let's go back into the Power Query portal now. So to access Dataflows, we need to make sure we're in the Maker portal first of all. We open up the Data tab down here, and we can see we've got an option here for Dataflows. And down here, we can see I've got a standard V2 data flow, which does my sync into the Dataverse environment. And I've got one here which exports out into Data Lake, which we'll take a look at in a short while. But let's just kick this one off first of all by just refreshing it. That will sort of do that in the background. And while we're sort of waiting on that, we can sort of just take a quick look at what it's sort of doing underneath the hood in a few minutes. So let that run now. But in terms of creating a data flow, it's really straightforward. You just start from blank at the top. So I'll just call this D365UG data flow. If we're importing into Dataverse, we want to make sure that we've not ticked this option on here. This option is for when we want to get this out into Azure, and we can see down here I've got an option here for a destination. This is basically my data lake out in Azure that I want to export out into. So I'll untip that for the second. We'll go into this just next step here just to see what we get here. And as we can see, we've got access to quite a lot of different data sources to pull data in. So, if it is just Excel, if it's, our Access database, SQL Server database, it could be SAP, maybe Salesforce, all of it can be sort of queried from here. So if I was, for example, to click on SQL Server database, I can then just put in the details of our particular environment down here. I can tag it onto my data gateway, configure authentication options for that, so whether it's basic or Windows or indeed a Microsoft account, and just connect up to that as if it was, as if I was working with Power BI Desktop, for example, or something like that. So the next step from there, once you've created your data source, is that you then get the Power Query Editor experience, and you get something that looks broadly similar to this. So if you spent any time at all in Power BI, this should hopefully all be second nature to you. But effectively, what we get here is a really nice sort of preview of our data before it's being loaded. So what we've effectively done here is we've got a main query on here that we've defined, which is our data to import. And this query is effectively resulting from our sort of on-premise SQL Server data source. So we can see if I click on Advanced Editor here, we can see here, yep, it's just a simple two-step query just to get all the data from the person table on there. We do some mashup of that. So basically, we use the Power Query Editor to basically expand out the columns that we need. And we get a sort of final input like this, a nicely normalized table on here, which has on our, our email address, telephone, all those sort of attributes that were external. And then as well, we also bring in what is currently in our contact table via in our Dataverse environment. Now, there's no Dataverse connector for Dataflows, but what we can do instead is, because we've got the web API and that's a no data data source in effect, we can just sort of query that using the sort of the appropriate endpoint in there. And then from there, we can then bring in our contacts table, and we can sort of work with it as if, and we can see all the sort of columns that we're hopefully a little bit familiar with start loading into there. So effectively, the end result is that I bring together the SQL data, I bring together the Dataverse data, and then we've got this consolidated data on here, which basically includes everything that's currently in the Dataverse and everything that's going to be incoming as well. And we just basically just do a distinct query on our key attributes, the ones we know will always be unique, to remove those duplicates from there, and then we effectively get just a big consolidated data source on there ready to go. And we can see we've got a lot of different options on here that we can potentially leverage. So, doing things such as, let's say, a custom column, a derived column from an example, being able to format our data, extract things out, add new columns on, be able to actually write out scripts if we wanted to. All of this is supported, and we've got quite a nice, rich experience on here that we can sort of use to help us along, which is really good. So when we're ready to go with our data flow, we can then just click the next button down here. And this is the stage where we get the options about, okay, well, which queries do we want to map to a particular table in our Dataverse environment? So we can effectively have as many queries as we want in our data flow, but in this case, what we've decided is that these three on here, we don't want to map across. We've deactivated them, and contact import is the main query that we're concerned with in terms of mapping. So you can see we get a sort of experience similar to sort of this on here. If it's the options do not load, it appears as blank like so. We can load to a new table, so we can actually let the data flow create our table for us as we map it in. I don't really recommend it. It actually kind of makes my skin crawl. I think you always want to make sure that maybe from a modeling standpoint, you're modeling out Dataverse yourself ideally, and in addition, avoiding stuff like this where you've got prefixes on your data, which maybe a little bit ugly for you. So generally, I'd probably recommend that you always try and load into an existing table where you can. The thing you may just need to make sure that you bear in mind with this is that sometimes you may need to set up the appropriate alternate keys for the data that you're mapping into. So we can see in this case that I'm wanting to delete rows that no longer exist in my query output. I've ticked that option down there, but I can only do that because I've had an alternate key set up for my particular table in question. So you should hopefully, if you're not familiar with what alternate keys are, I should say, they're really easy to set up. So if I go back into here, if I go into my environment, I've got a solution set up. So Dataflow session. All you do is you add in your appropriate table. You can see you've got a keys option up here. You just define your key with a display name and a logical name. You tick the fields that you want to that are your key fields. So in this case, the first name, last name, and salutation. Create that. There'll be a system job that kicks off behind the scenes that will create effectively creates an index behind the scenes on the SQL database. Give that time to run. Then when that's set up and ready to go, you'll then be able to sort of leverage that alternate key for when you're doing this sort of mapping on here. You may also sometimes need an alternate key. So if the situation is where the field you're mapping to doesn't appear on the list on here, one of the ways that you can get around that is by setting up an alternate key. So that will typically sometimes arise when you've maybe got related columns that you want to map to or things like that. So let's say, as an example, I wanted to do, parent account for the contact, for example. I don't believe, if we double check down here, we can't seem to find that particular field down there. If I was to go into my account table, create an alternate key for, let's say, my account name field, return into the Dataflow experience, what I should then see is a new field that I can map to, which will be my account name field. And it will have a sort of similar name to this, or have the schema name, and then it will be .name or something like that. So alternate keys are really important for data flows, both in terms of trying to achieve that sort of synchronization type thing, and also for when you're looking at more complex mapping options. So hopefully that makes sense. But effectively, once that's all sorted, you just do your straight mapping. If you're a bit lazy like me, as long as you just make sure that your source columns are named to match your destination columns, you can use the auto map option up there, and it'll just figure it all out for you, which is really nice. Then when you're ready to go, you've then got your options, or you will have your options. If you click, make sure you don't load that in. You then get the options then of being able to do your refresh settings. So you've got a couple options on here. You can have it so you just refresh manually. So you do, as we did a few minutes ago, you just click on the button and it refreshes it on demand effectively. Alternatively, as I say, you can also configure frequency-based refreshes. So literally you could have one running every minute at the moment, or you could have it run on specific days and times. I don't know about everyone else, but see over time, I think if people are running data flows every minute, I don't think this is going to be free for much longer, but let's wait and see. Hopefully people won't take abuse, but you have got those options there at the moment, potentially. And what's nice as well, you can actually get an email notification through. So if the data flow fails, you just basically, the owner of the data flow will just get an email through, just telling them that it's basically failed. So that could be quite nice if case, just so that you can keep an eye on things and make sure that things aren't potentially breaking. So we can see that the data flow run that we just did has completed successfully. I can tell because I've not got any yellow warning signs there, and I can see that the time that we selected a few minutes ago is on there. So as if by magic, fingers crossed, no contacts in there. Demo has broken. Okay. So if I'd run the query correctly, we'd see some additional contacts in there. But effectively, here's where I rescue things now. Here's one I made earlier. So you can see we've got all the contacts down here which have synced in from the SQL Server database. If we click on here, we can see all of the attributes that we've sort of chosen as part of our data flow: business phone, email address, I think address details as well. Where's it gone on here? It's not on this form, I don't think. But yeah, we can effectively map in our contacts in this way. So at this point, okay, well, something's clearly gone wrong. So I need to figure out what's gone wrong. So to do that, what I can actually do is if I click on the 3 dots there, click on show refresh history, I basically get a log of everything that's run previously on here. So I can see for this previous one on here, okay, it actually was succeeded when it last sort of run. So maybe, okay, well, I know then based on that, okay, well, maybe this isn't something to do with our particular data flow. It's perhaps you know, a human error, a Joe error, shall we say. But I can see in this case that regardless of whether the operation has succeeded or indeed failed, we can download a little CSV file that gives us hopefully a bit more some useful information about what's gone on. So we can see in this case that things ran okay. We upserted about 1,396 records in total. So obviously there must be a problem with the SQL query that I ran, which means that we've not seen those additional contacts in there. If there was a failure, then we get potentially something a bit more useful. So if I click on one of these previous fail runs down here, I can see down here that I've got an error down here saying, okay, well, some rows have basically failed to upsert correctly. And the problem in this particular example was that I had duplicate values in the SQL Server data source. So, for example, I had Jennifer, how do you pronounce that? Jennifer Rigler, who was in the SQL Server database twice with the same first name and the same last name and citation. So therefore, it couldn't insert it again. It would violate our key, our alternate key that we've defined at the Dataverse level. So hopefully, either way, using this, we can get to the bottom and see, okay, what's actually happened with our particular data flow. And in this case, as I say, it's a human error. A Joe error on that one. So apologies, that's not quite what is expected on that one. Okay, now we mentioned earlier about the ability to export out into Data Lake. So if we go into the second data flow that we set up on here that's doing all of that, we can see that we've got pretty much the same kind of experience. The only key difference that we've got is that we've got this map to entity option up here. So effectively what we can do for each of the tables that we're bringing in, we've already done it in this case, but if I was to click on the gear icon on this one, we can see we get a nice little dialog box like this where we can then just set up the mappings for our particular data flow to our CDM object type. So we can see all the common CDM table objects are here down here, and then we can then just either just set up an auto mapping rule, provided our columns are the same name, or we can define our mappings manually. Now the key thing is that we can't map one field to multiple CDM fields. We have to make sure that we've got that one-to-one mapping in place. But other than that, you can map any data attribute of your choice as part of that, which is quite nice. Then when that's all set up and basically ready to go, you define a sort of a refresh schedule around it. As we can see, it last refreshed for me well today actually, yesterday at 3:30. And then to sort of view that, we then need to go out into our Azure data lake that we've set up. So a data lake is basically, it's like I guess a posh storage account. It's like a storage account that's a bit fussy over what's stored in there. So there's some specific options that we enabled for this storage account when we created it. And as a consequence, we can see down here, our containers logo has got some water in it. And we can see down here that we've got information about not only our data flows stored on here, but also the the one that we set up. So it stores things based on environments. So we can see down here, it's picked up our specific environment that we've got on here. So if you've got multiple environments, you can store them out in this sort of format over here. Then we've got the data lake export here, which has our export from the SQL Server database. And all we're doing here is we're just extracting out some sales order detail and header records and mapping these out into sort of ready to go objects for import. So we can see in this case for this CSV, if I download this on here, we can take a look at how this data comes out as. Give it a second just to download. Open it in Excel. Yeah, so we can see we basically just get a headerless CSV extract of our data, which we can then do what we want with really from a import point of view. So this will be more for situations where maybe you want to have that really nice big data processing. You want to chuck this out into, let's say, a machine learning model or do some really sort of big data processing on it. But you don't necessarily want to have to go through the faff of writing your own bespoke integration to get out into Azure. What the Dataflows will do here, provided that obviously your license and got the correct licenses, is that you can map this out in a very easy to do sort of way. And if we go up a level back on this account over here, we should see that we've got details about the model that we're working with. So let me just open that up so we can have a quick look at how that looks. Give me a moment. So make sure it's in Notepad and that we can review it. Okay. So this is what we get out. So this effectively is our definition of our table that we're mapping out. So it basically includes all the details that we want on there, including the name of our columns and their appropriate data types. So typically some services that rely on the common data model will typically ask for a definition or a JSON file like this. So what this effectively does is it basically just saves you some time. You can basically just take this, plonk it into your appropriate service, whether it's Data Factory or something else, and you can then start to use that as you see fit, really. Okay, and I think the final thing just to show is that we also get some details on here about our data flows itself. So again, if we take a quick look at this file, once it's all downloaded, let's make this look pretty. Okay, so this one's quite a bit better actually, and maybe useful, I guess, from a maybe from a DevOps point of view, or just maybe just in making sure you've got a backup. But if we look down here, we can see that we actually can export out the whole of our Power Query query, including all of its appropriate details, as we can see, the name of it, what tenant, who owns it, all that sort of stuff. And then this massive document on here is basically just an encoded version of the Power Query that's set up for it. So all of this gets exported out into Azure potentially if we've got the integration set up with our data lake, and we can basically get this out and then we do what we want with it. Whether it's just to have a backup of it, or if you wanted to get it into DevOps as well, that could be a potential option. And it's really easy to sort of set this up. If we were to go back into the Maker portal just very quickly before we round up. All we do is we need to make sure that we've got a data lake resource set up in the same environment as the one that we're currently working in. So I can see at the moment I'm in UK West. We then just select our appropriate subscription. I forget which one it's in. I think it's this one. Where is it? This one on here. Then we can see that the applicable storage accounts will then be displayed down there. And then you just click save on there. It will create that connection. It will create the appropriate objects in your data lake account, and then you'll be good to go from there. Okay, so Andrew Cow's got a good question. So what availability for ADLS Gen 2 is there for customers in the UK? Which regions? And is it available now for use with D365 F&O? So I think it's available for UK West, as we just saw a second ago. UK West, I think, aligns to UK South as well from an environment standpoint, from Dataverse's perspective. So you can set. So what that will mean is that you can then set up your data lake storage account in those applicable regions in Azure, and you should have no restrictions sort of doing that. In terms of whether it's available for use with D365 F&O, I'm not sure on that one. I'm going to hazard a guess and say yes, because I know that, because I'm pretty sure there's a lot of consistency now across the board with this stuff. But yeah, probably go away. Best to check that yourself, I think. Okay, I think we're doing okay for time. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the demo today. So let's go back to the slides and wrap things up, and then we'll hopefully have some time for questions as well. So I think my sort of thoughts on Dataflows is that I think they're at that point now where Microsoft are investing quite heavily in them. I think certainly compared to a year ago, the sort of the general experience has been improved significantly, and there's new stuff that's come recently as part of the recent waves as well. So I think we want to make sure that we're keeping up with the Joneses to an extent with this stuff. And it will be probably something that Microsoft continually invest in. So it's probably worth bearing it in mind as a potential option, even if you're not necessarily, sold on it today. And I think indeed, if you are finding yourself at the moment, with really complex data import or data integration routines, and you're trying to find a better way of doing things that hopefully will make things a bit easier, and most importantly, make things a bit more portable. If indeed you wanted to, let's say, move things into Data Factory, convert it into a reporting future, the potentially Dataflows is a good candidate for you to consider as part of that. But ultimately, it's only, for the super duper complex stuff, I think ultimately, you're going to have to involve Azure to some degree to sort of achieve that. Certainly, you have got those options that I spoke about before. So if you are really wanting to have SSIS packages and things like that, there's stuff is stopping you from doing that. But I would sort of caution, sort of advise you, okay, well, maybe you need to be looking at these sort of newer sort of Azure services instead. They'll tend to hopefully be a bit more nicer experiences, certainly from a DevOps standpoint, and certainly from an investment standpoint. That's where Microsoft are going to be going to in the future.
Joe, you have a couple of questions in the chat.
I do, yes, I've just seen them. So let's go through them. So Dean's got a question. Is there a limit on the number of rows Dataflows can import? That's a good question. I don't think so. I think the only limitation you may see is if let's say you exhaust your API limits. So effectively, because it's going in via the API, if there's any enforcement or throttling on there, then effectively you may get a failure or an error on there. But provided you've got the storage and provided you've got the throughput from an API request on there, there probably isn't no limit on there in terms of what you can import. And then Ravi Mystery's got a question around, can you set up deduping rules when importing? That's a really good question. Now, I'm just trying to think now, but I'm pretty sure that data duplication rules aren't enforced for SDK operations. Feridun, you may be able to correct me if I'm wrong there.
Data duplication. Well, it's not enforced anywhere, really, is it? It's only a warning in the user interface. Do you mean in the apps?
Yeah, I'm thinking because ultimately I think this is using SDK to get into Dataverse.
Right.
I was pretty sure that
the only thing that would break it, actually, I think, is an alternate key. If you have an alternate key, it will refuse to import, I think.
Yeah, as we saw earlier. So
yeah,
so you wouldn't use a deduplication, data duplication rule. You'd use an alternate key.
Yeah, it's only a user interface pop-up window that says, oh, you might have a duplicate, but if you want to save it anyway, you still can.
Yeah, so in that scenario, Ravi, set up alternate keys for the ones where you want to make sure there's no duplicates on there. Then, as we saw earlier, you'll then get an error message, specific error message when importing when that's violated. That's how you get around that.
I've got a question if there aren't any others.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
In one of your very early slides, you talked about other traditional tools. Do you think those traditional tools like the Kingswaysoft and so on still have a place for one-off migrations where you're not doing a recurring thing?
Yeah, it's a good one, that, because I guess ultimately it comes down to, I guess, what you've got from a skill set point of view to a large extent. Because SSIS can be as straightforward or as complex as you want, really, when you get into it.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think certainly, it's I can see, obviously, you want to be going with the reliable, old reliable. She never lets me down, Kingswaysoft. It's so I can understand that. I guess my only caution around that, okay, well, obviously use the tool for the best tool for the job, but SSIS definitely does have a legacy feel these days. And I think it's interesting as well when you see what Kingswaysoft are doing. They now, as part of their connector, have an Azure Data Factory option as part of that. So I think even they are sort of seeing the writing on the wall around it.
Indeed.
So that would be the only comment I'd say. So it may be that in that scenario, okay, well, Dataflows could be a good one for you to look at, because you'd really maybe only want to be using Kingswaysoft when you've got those complex mappings or those complex data integration scenarios for the one-offs.
Right. Okay. Very good.
It's a good one. I mean, just do people still use Kingswaysoft just out of interest?
Well, I certainly do, which is why I asked the question. Yeah.
As I say, I can see it, but yeah, it's how you get. I guess perhaps if you're coming into the platform new as well, I guess for us old hands, if you want to call it that, and I mean myself there, obviously. SSIS has been around the block, and we're sort of used to it and stuff like that. But I guess maybe somebody new coming into the platform, or indeed, a citizen developer.
Yeah.
I like that, hump and dump.
Yeah,
I love that. That's a great way to describe it. I love that, hump and dump.
Yes, very good.
Yeah, but certainly, yeah. I mean, citizen developer, you show them SSIS, will they necessarily be going away with it straight away? I'm not too sure.
It's got a learning curve, like anything, isn't it?
This is it. Just one other question from Mike. Can Dataflows do a chain of imports? Yes, and indeed, that may be necessary based on your needs. So on a recent project, we did the chaining imports based on a schedule. So effectively, import the accounts first, then next importing the contacts, then import on any dependency records on there. So effectively, how you would have to do it is you'd have to have it on a schedule, on a rolling schedule, so to be able to do that. But yes, you would have to effectively have one data flow for the set of records that you wanted to import in order. No worries, Mike.
That looks like we're at the end.
Can you do a rollback as well on a chain? I'm going to say no, but yes. No, in the sense of you can't do it easily. Yes, if you were to tinker about a bit and maybe have some sort of plugins or some sort of logic at the platform level, you can maybe do it. But no, you can't do a clean rollback, I'd say.
So that'd be a NES.
A NES.
NES.
Is that an acronym, is it?
No, so yes, no, NES.
A NES, yeah, I like it, yeah. Cool.
Right.
Okay, so I think we're pretty much done. So have we got feedback forms for today, Foden, that we need to?
There is a link somewhere. I fortunately don't have it to hand, but we definitely do have a link on the bit.ly with the sessions. I'll dig it out and post it in one of the next sessions. Cool. But yes, please do the feedback, because there's a chance to win that fabulous Lego.
Yeah, and as I say, all feedback is good feedback as well. So yeah, it's always good just stuff here. If you what you like, what you didn't like, and stuff. It always helps the speakers, and obviously the organisers as well, to see what's great. So yeah, all I need to say is I hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.
I think some applause is in order.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, everyone. And now you've got 10 minutes to choose between the low-code platform where the devs fit in, or universal resource scheduling at scale.
Oh, that's Marlin's and Matty's talk.
Yes,
I'm definitely going for that one, I think.
Right, thanks, Joe.
Cool. Thanks all. See you later.